The first time it happened, it didn't feel like a betrayal, at least not at first. It was something that seemed to happen out of nowhere. They were sitting in a bar after work, both tired and a little drunk, laughing at the dumb things that had happened during the day. He had always been someone who easily charmed others, and she had always felt a little overlooked, but that night, there was a spark between them. He had smiled at her in a way that made her feel special, like she was the only person in the room. He wasn't just being friendly. He was paying attention. For once, she felt like he was truly listening. That night, she didn't think about her partner at home or the promises they'd made to each other. She didn't think about the long, drawn-out conversations they'd had about trust and the future. All she could focus on was the magnetic pull between her and this stranger, someone who made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. He leaned closer, his hand brushed against hers, and the moment she touched him, she knew there was no turning back. They ended up at his place, where everything felt like a whirlwind. It wasn't planned. It wasn't meant to happen. It just did. The next morning, guilt hit her like a truck. She tried to push it away, telling herself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. She was caught up in the moment, and it meant nothing, right? But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She knew that once that line had been crossed, everything would change. She couldn't undo it, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a choice that would haunt her. But what was worse was the shame. The feeling of being a liar. The feeling of being someone she didn't recognize. And so, she told herself it was just a slip-up, an isolated event, and promised she would never let it happen again. But the guilt lingered, festering. Her partner didn't notice the change at first, of course. He never did. They were too busy with their own lives, their own distractions. Life moved on, and soon enough, the affair was forgotten. At least, she tried to forget it. She pretended it was a mistake, something that had no meaning in the grand scheme of things. But the truth was, the first betrayal never really left her. It was always there, in the back of her mind, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Then, over time, the distance between her and her partner grew. They were no longer the couple who laughed together over coffee or stayed up late talking about their hopes and dreams. They had become two people living separate lives under the same roof. She was lonely, disconnected, and began to look for attention from outside the relationship. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't something she planned, but the need for validation became overpowering. He was always there, someone who saw her in a way her partner no longer did. She thought about that night, the thrill of being wanted, and the feeling of being special. And so, the temptation grew, until one day, she found herself back in his arms. This time, it wasn't as impulsive. It was calculated. She knew what she was doing. She had convinced herself that her partner wouldn't notice, that no one would ever find out. She told herself she wasn't doing anything wrong, that she deserved this. After all, hadn't she been neglected? Hadn't she been longing for affection for so long? And yet, even as she convinced herself of all of this, the guilt weighed heavier. But the desire, the craving for attention and intimacy, overpowered it. So, it happened again. And again. 6 times, over the course of several months. Each time, she told herself it would be the last. She wasn't the kind of person who would cheat. She wasn't a liar. But each time, the cycle repeated. She would go back to him, and each time, the betrayal became easier to justify. After all, what was a little more time away from her partner? What was a little more lying if it made her feel better, made her feel alive again? She told herself that maybe this was what she needed, that it wasn't such a big deal. But deep down, she knew she was falling into a dangerous pattern, one that would eventually shatter everything. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but by the 6th time, she wasn't just cheating. She was trapped in a web of lies, struggling to keep up with the story she'd built. She wasn't just lying to her partner. She was lying to herself. The first betrayal had been an accident, but after that it became a choice. And with each choice, the trust she had once shared with her partner evaporated a little more. She wasn't just afraid of being caught anymore. She was afraid of losing herself completely. By the time the truth finally came crashing down, She had no idea how to fix it. The first betrayal had been a slip-up. The second, a mistake. By the time it reached 6, it was too far gone. She didn't know how to go back, how to face her partner, how to explain that everything had spiraled out of control. What would she even say? Would he ever forgive her? Would they even survive this? The guilt that had been so overwhelming the first time now felt like a constant presence, weighing her down with every decision she made. And yet, in a way, the guilt was also familiar. It had become part of her routine, the constant tug of right and wrong, the conflict inside her that she couldn't escape. She had crossed a line, and with every instance, that line had gotten blurry. Would she ever be able to look at herself the same way again? Or had she become someone she didn't recognize? The first time it happened, she justified it by telling herself that it was a mistake, just a one-time slip. But after the second, third, and eventually the sixth, the justifications became harder to believe. She had crossed a line, and now it was as though that line no longer existed. Each instance started to feel more like an inevitability than a choice. The cycle had begun, and despite all the guilt, the affair continued. At first, there were moments of hesitation, moments where she felt that pulling away was possible. But then, there were the rationalizations, those little whispers that convinced her it wasn't so bad. Her relationship had been lacking something for a long time. The affection had dulled, the conversations had become repetitive, and the spark that once existed between her and her partner had long since faded. She told herself she deserved this attention. She told herself she deserved to feel wanted, admired, and seen in a way her partner no longer made her feel. The affair was not just about physical pleasure. It was about an emotional escape. It was about someone who made her feel special, someone who made her feel alive again. The first few times, it was easy to convince herself that it would stop at 1 or 2. It was a temporary distraction, she told herself, nothing more. But the further the affair went, the more it became a crutch. Each time she returned to him, the rationalizations grew louder, and the consequences seemed to matter less. The guilt never disappeared, but it did start to dull. It was a constant battle between what she knew was wrong and what she felt was missing from her life. It wasn't that she didn't love her partner. It was just that there was something missing, something she couldn't ignore. The affair became a way to fill that void. The mental gymnastics she performed to justify it were exhausting, but somehow they worked. It wasn't just about the physical acts anymore, it was about the emotional validation. When she was with him, she felt seen. The moment the truth came out, everything changed. She hadn't expected it to happen the way it did. There were no clues leading up to the discovery, no subtle hints that the truth was about to come crashing down. It was sudden, brutal, and without warning. Her partner had found out, and it was as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She could feel the weight of every lie she had told, every story she had spun, crashing down on her in a single, unforgiving moment. The shock in his eyes was impossible to ignore, and the silence between them was deafening. It wasn't just disappointment. It was betrayal, pure and simple. The first words out of his mouth were the ones she had been dreading. How long? His voice trembled, and the pain in his eyes was almost unbearable. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the words stuck. How could she explain something that didn't have a real explanation? How could she justify the choices she had made when there was no reasonable excuse for any of it? She had convinced herself that she could keep this secret forever, that the lies would never come to light. But here she was, caught in the act of betraying everything she had once held dear. The guilt, which had already been eating away at her, intensified to a level she hadn't imagined possible. There was no denying it now, no more pushing it aside or pretending it didn't matter. It was all out in the open, and as the truth sank in, the reality of what she had done began to hit her in waves. Every moment of weakness, every time she chose to go back to him, now seemed like an unforgivable sin. She had known better, yet she still crossed that line again and again. Her partner's face was a mixture of disbelief and anger, his voice barely a whisper as he asked, "Why?" The question hung in the air, and she couldn't bring herself to answer it fully. The truth was, She didn't even have a real reason. There had been no moment of clarity, no decision where she had chosen to cheat. It had been a series of small decisions that added up to something much bigger, something far more destructive. The affair hadn't been about him. It hadn't been about her partner at all. It had been about something deeper, something she couldn't explain. But in the end, none of it mattered. The damage was done. Her partner's pain was palpable. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the realization that everything they had built together had been built on lies. She watched as the trust they once had shattered in front of her eyes, and with it, any hope of things ever being the same again. The truth wasn't just a betrayal of their relationship. It was a betrayal of everything they had worked for, everything they had promised each other. And in that moment, she saw the person she had once loved, the person who had believed in her, who had trusted her, crumble under the weight of her actions. It was a sight she would never forget. As the silence stretched between them, she could feel herself breaking. There was no way to take back the things she had done, no way to rewind the clock and make different choices. She had already lost him. The truth had exposed all the cracks, all the lies she had been telling herself, and now there was nothing left but the harsh reality of what she had become.
He didn't yell.
He didn't throw things or make a scene. Instead, he stood there, his eyes full of hurt, disappointment, and a sadness that she couldn't bear to see. He had trusted her. He had loved her. And she had destroyed that trust with one selfish decision after another. It wasn't just the act of cheating, it was the dishonesty, the manipulation, the coldness with which she had hidden the truth. She had lied to him in ways that went beyond just hiding the affair. She had lied about how she felt, about what she wanted, about the very essence of their relationship. She tried to apologize, to explain herself, but the words felt hollow. How could she apologize for something so destructive, so unforgivable? The reality was that no amount of apologizing would make it right. He had been hurt beyond repair, and even if he said he forgave her, the trust would never be the same. It would never go back to how it was. She couldn't undo the damage. And that was the hardest part, knowing that no matter how much she regretted what she had done, there was no way to fix it. As the confrontation drew on, her partner seemed to retreat into himself. He was no longer the person she had known. The person who had once held her close and laughed with her, the person who had believed in their future together, was now a stranger. The anger had started to simmer beneath the surface, but more than anything, there was just a deep sadness. A sadness that was more painful than anything she had ever felt before. She had broken him, and there was nothing she could do to put him back together. The confrontation ended without a resolution. There were no answers, no closure. Just a profound sense of loss. She had no idea what would happen next. Would they try to rebuild? Would he ever look at her the same way again? Would she be able to live with the guilt? The questions piled up, but none of them mattered. She had already done the damage. And now, all she had left was the haunting reality of a choice she had made, and the consequences she couldn't escape. As she sat in the aftermath of the confrontation, the silence felt suffocating. The world had changed in an instant. The weight of the truth was heavier than she could have ever imagined. The affair had started as a selfish act, but now it was much more than that. It was the end of something. Whether that something was the relationship or her own sense of self, she couldn't be sure. What she did know was that everything was broken, and it might never be fixed. The aftermath of the discovery felt like a relentless weight pressing down on her chest. The silence in the days following the confrontation was unbearable. She knew that her partner was processing everything in his own way, but that didn't stop the gnawing feeling in her stomach, the constant reminder of what she had done. She couldn't escape the shame, and every time she looked at him, she was reminded of how deeply she had hurt him. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship had been shattered, and no matter how much time passed, it felt like the cracks would never be repaired. They were both left standing in the rubble of something that had once felt so solid and unbreakable. Her partner became distant, more withdrawn with each passing day. He didn't yell, didn't demand explanations anymore. It was as if the emotional energy he had once poured into their relationship had been siphoned away, leaving nothing but a cold, lingering emptiness. She could see the toll the betrayal had taken on him. His eyes, once filled with warmth and love, now appeared hollow, filled with a quiet hurt that pierced through her every time she saw him. The man she had once known, trusted, loved, was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She had hoped for some kind of redemption, a chance to fix things, to apologize and make amends. But as the days dragged on, she realized that the damage wasn't something that could simply be fixed with words or promises. The trust that had been broken wasn't something that could.